Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Amy Wroe Bechtel disappearance. To understand what happened to Amy, we must first find ourselves in the rugged, high-desert beauty of Lander, Wyoming, in the midsummer of 1997. It was a time when the air was thick with the scent of wild sage and sun-baked pine, and the Wind River Mountains loomed over the landscape like ancient, jagged sentinels. For Amy, a 24-year-old athlete with the world ahead of her, these mountains were not just scenery. They were her training ground, her sanctuary, and on the morning of July 24th, they were the backdrop for a series of mundane errands that would mark her final hours in the light. The sun rose that Thursday with a gentle heat, casting a golden hue over the streets of Lander. It was a town where everyone seemed to know their neighbor, and the slow pace of life felt safe, buffered by the vast, unyielding wilderness that surrounded it. Amy was a woman of motion, a runner whose spirit was as tireless as her legs, and she began her day with the quiet discipline that defined her life as an aspiring Olympic marathoner. The morning was busy but bright. Amy and her husband, Steve, had recently closed on a new home, a small house on McDougal Drive that represented a new chapter for the young couple. They had been married for just over a year, a time of building and planning. On this particular morning, the couple shared a brief goodbye. Steve was heading out with a friend to scout new rock climbing routes near Dubois, while Amy had her own list of tasks to complete. She was the kind of person who lived by lists, keeping track of the small details of life on scraps of paper. Around 9:30 that morning, she made her way to the Wind River Fitness Center. As she led a youth weightlifting class, her voice echoed through the gym, encouraging the children with the same vibrant energy she brought to her own training. Those who saw her that morning remember her as upbeat and focused, though perhaps a little high-strung, as she balanced her teaching duties with the mounting list of responsibilities that come with moving into a new home. She wore the clothes of a woman ready for action. A bright yellow tank top that caught the light, dark shorts, and her trusted Adidas running shoes, the soles worn thin from miles of dedication to the trail. After her class finished, Amy moved through the town of Lander like a leaf caught in a summer breeze. She visited a local recycling center, then stopped by the camera store known as the Camera Connection. It was around 2:30 in the afternoon when she stepped into the shop, the bell above the door chiming softly to announce her arrival. The air inside smelled of chemicals and old paper. She spoke with a staff member about a photography competition she was interested in entering, showing a glimpse of the creative soul that lived alongside the athlete. The clerk would later recall that she seemed to be in a bit of a hurry, glancing at her watch several times as they spoke. Perhaps she was thinking about the time she had left in the day, or perhaps her mind was already drifting toward the mountains. Before leaving town, she also checked on the utilities for their new house, ensuring the phone and gas would be ready for their transition. Every task she completed was a stitch in the fabric of a future she would never get to see. With her errands finished, she climbed into her white Toyota Tercel station wagon, a humble vehicle that carried her through the dusty Wyoming roads, and turned her sights toward the high country of the Shoshone National Forest. The drive out of Lander towards Sinks Canyon is a journey of ascending beauty. As Amy drove, the elevation began to climb, and the temperature dropped just enough to make the mountain air feel crisp and invigorating. The road winds alongside the middle fork of the Popo-Agi River, where the water rushes over ancient limestone before vanishing into a cavern, only to reappear further down the canyon. It is a place of mystery and natural wonder, where the steep canyon walls rise up in shades of red and gray. Amy followed the switchbacks, the engine of the Toyota humming as it labored up the steep grade. She was heading for the Loop Road, a 30-mile stretch of gravel and dirt that traverses the high ridges of the Wind River Range. Her goal for the afternoon was one of professional passion. She was organizing a 10-kilometer mountain run scheduled for the coming September, and she needed to scout the route. She wanted to feel the terrain under her feet, to mark the mileposts in her mind, and to ensure the path was ready for the runners who would follow in her wake. The further she drove, the more the town faded into a distant memory, replaced by the vast silence of the lodgepole pines and the shimmering heat waves rising from the gravel road. She eventually reached an area known as Burnt Gulch, a place where the forest opens up into rolling meadows and dense thickets of timber. It was approximately 4:30 in the afternoon when she pulled the white Toyota to the shoulder of the road. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long, thin shadows across the forest floor. Amy stepped out of the car, the dry mountain air greeting her. She didn't bother to lock the doors. In these mountains, in 1997, the idea of danger felt as distant as the stars. She left her keys inside, resting on the passenger seat atop her handwritten to-do list. Her sunglasses, a pair valued at over $100, were left beside them. She took only her wallet and a small fanny pack, perhaps containing a few essentials for the trail. She stood for a moment, adjusting her laces, the silence of the wilderness broken only by the occasional rustle of a breeze through the needles of the pines. She was alone, but as an experienced runner, she was comfortable in her solitude. She began her jog, her heartbeat steady, her breath synchronized with the rhythm of her movement. She was scouting the first few miles of the race course, noting the landmarks of the trail as she moved deeper into the shadows of the forest. The details of what happened next are lost to the wind and the trees. As the afternoon light began to fade into a bruised purple twilight, Amy did not return to the white Toyota. The forest, which had felt like a playground only hours before, began to transform as the sun dipped below the peaks. In the growing darkness, the silence of Burnt Gulch became heavy and absolute. Back in town, the clock ticked toward evening, and the first ripples of concern began to stir. Steve would return home to find an empty house, and the friends who loved Amy would soon be scouring the mountain roads with flashlights, their beams cutting through the blackness in a desperate search for a woman who seemed to have dissolved into the mountain air itself. The run on Loop Road was supposed to be a simple scouting mission, a quiet moment of preparation for a future event. Instead, it became the point of no return. We leave Amy there for now, a splash of yellow against the deep green of the pines, moving through a landscape that was about to keep its secrets for decades to come. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let the image of the mountain road linger as we prepare to follow the trail into the cold night that followed. The darkness of the Wind River Range is not like the darkness of the town below. In Lander, there are the soft glows of porch lights and the distant, rhythmic hum of the highway. But as the elevation rises toward the Shoshone National Forest, the world begins to swallow itself in a heavy, velvet silence. On that night in late July, 1997, the air grew thin and sharp, carrying the scent of dried pine needles and the damp, cool breath of the high mountain lakes. Steve had waited as long as his nerves would allow, watching the clock hands creep past 10 in the evening, past 10:30, until the quiet of their new home became a deafening roar of absence. He reached for the telephone, his fingers tracing the plastic keypad as he dialed the sheriff's department, his voice sounding thin in the empty room as he reported that his wife, a woman who lived by the rhythm of her running shoes, had not returned from the mountain. While the authorities began to mobilize, the first real movements of the search were born from friendship and a growing, gnawing dread. Todd and Amy Skinner, close friends of the couple, did not wait for the formal machinery of the law to grind into gear. They climbed into their vehicle, the headlights cutting twin paths of amber light through the pitch-black shadows of Loop Road. The gravel crunched beneath their tires, a harsh, lonely sound that echoed off the granite faces of the canyons as they climbed higher into the wilderness, their eyes straining against the dark for any flash of white metal or the familiar silhouette of a runner on the shoulder of the road. The road twisted and turned, a serpentine path through the dense stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. Every few miles, the forest would open into a clearing where the moonlight spilled across the sagebrush like spilled milk, casting long, distorted shadows that looked for all the world like a person standing still. It was roughly 1 a.m. when the headlights finally caught something. There, near the turnoff for Burnt Gulch, sat a small, white Toyota Tercel station wagon. It looked small and fragile against the backdrop of the massive, ancient trees. As the Skinners pulled their car to a stop, the dust from the road swirled in the beams of their lights, dancing like tiny ghosts before settling back into the earth. The silence that met them when they cut the engine was absolute. There was no sound of a struggle, no smell of burning rubber, just the cool mountain breeze whistling through the nearby gulch. Todd stepped out of the car, the soles of his boots snapping dry twigs with a sound like pistol shots in the quiet night. He approached the Toyota, his heart hammering against his ribs. The car was parked neatly, as if it had simply been left there for a moment, but the lack of movement from within sent a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. He reached out and pulled on the door handle. It opened with a soft, metallic click. It was unlocked, a common practice in this part of the world where neighbors were few and trust was as abundant as the mountain air. Inside the Toyota, the air was still and carried the faint, lingering scent of Amy's perfume and the earthy musk of the outdoors. The beam of a flashlight swept across the interior, illuminating a scene that was hauntedly domestic. Resting on the passenger seat was Amy's to-do list, a simple piece of paper that mapped out the mundane intentions of a day that had turned into a nightmare. On that list, 4 of the 13 items had been checked off in neat, precise ink. It was a map of a life interrupted. Tucked beneath the paper were her car keys, resting exactly where she had placed them, and beside them lay her expensive sunglasses, valued at $120. These were not the items of someone who intended to leave their life behind. They were the belongings of someone who expected to return in an hour, sweaty and breathless from a run, ready to drive back down the mountain to the house they had just bought. The only thing missing, the only void in the inventory of her life, was her green Eagle Creek wallet and the fanny pack she often wore. The flashlight moved to the floorboards, finding nothing but the shadows. There was no blood, no signs of a scuffle, no shattered glass. It was as if Amy had simply evaporated, leaving her keys and her plans behind to gather the mountain dust. Todd's voice called out her name into the trees, but the sound was swallowed by the vastness of the forest, returning only as a faint, hollow echo from the cliffs above. By 3 a.m, the lonely stretch of Shoshone Lake Road had become a hive of desperate activity. The stillness of the night was shattered by the arrival of law enforcement and a growing number of volunteers who had been pulled from their beds by the urgent news. The light of the moon was now rivaled by the flashing red and blue strobes of sheriff's cruisers, reflecting off the white paint of the abandoned Toyota and the surrounding pine needles. Men and women in heavy jackets moved through the underbrush, their flashlights creating a chaotic lattice of light among the trees. The ground was hard and unforgiving, covered in a carpet of needles and stones that guarded its secrets well. Nearby, at Sawmill Creek, the water rushed over the rocks with a constant, whispering hiss, a sound that seemed to mock the searchers as they waded through the tall grass, calling Amy's name until their voices grew hoarse. The initial theory was simple and grounded in the harsh reality of the Wyoming wilderness. Perhaps she had tripped on a hidden route and tumbled down one of the steep embankments. Perhaps a mountain lion, silent and predatory, had watched her from the shadows of the granite peaks. Or maybe a bear, startled in the brush, had reacted with sudden, lethal force. Every rustle of the wind in the leaves, every snap of a branch in the distance, sent a jolt of adrenaline through the searchers, a flicker of hope that they would find her huddling against the cold, perhaps injured but alive. As the hours ticked toward the first gray light of dawn, the scale of the effort expanded. More than 100 volunteers eventually arrived, their faces etched with the fatigue of a night spent in the thin air of the high country. Scent dogs were brought in, their noses pressing deep into the soil and the floor mats of the white Toyota, searching for a trail that seemed to lead nowhere. They circled the car, their tails low, whining into the darkness as the scent of the woman they were looking for seemed to stop abruptly at the edge of the gravel road. Above, the stars began to pale as the deep indigo of the night gave way to a bruised purple horizon. A helicopter was readied for the morning, equipped with thermal sensors that would scan the dense canopy for the warmth of a human body. But for now, the searchers were limited to what they could see in the narrow beams of their lamps. The mountain felt crowded and yet profoundly empty. Each volunteer felt the weight of the vast, rugged terrain, the thousands of acres of rock and timber that could hide a person for an eternity. They moved in lines, shoulders apart, checking every hollowed-out log and every dark crevice in the rocks. The white Toyota remained parked at the center of it all, a silent sentinel and a grim monument to the last place Amy Wroe Bechtel was known to be. As the sun began to cast its first long shadows across Burnt Gulch, the hope that this would be a quick rescue began to shift into a heavy, cold realization that the mountain was not going to give her back easily. While the mountains were being combed by hundreds of rhythmic footsteps, the atmosphere within the walls of the Fremont County Sheriff's Office was shifting into something far more clinical and cold. The frantic energy of a rescue mission began to settle into the heavy, stagnant air of a criminal investigation. Sheriff David King sat in a room that smelled of stale coffee and old floor wax, contemplating a reality that felt as old as the hills themselves. Statistically, when a woman vanishes, the eyes of the law inevitably turn toward the one who shared her bed, the one who knew the cadence of her breath and the map of her day. It was a grim math, a calculation of proximity and probability that began to weigh heavily on the investigators. They looked at the white Toyota Tercel found at Burnt Gulch, its doors unlocked and its keys resting peacefully under a to-do list, and they began to wonder if the scene was a snapshot of a sudden tragedy or a carefully curated stage. The silence of the forest was being replaced by the hum of fluorescent lights and the scratching of pens on yellow legal pads as the focus tightened on Steve Bechtel. The investigation soon moved from the dirt paths of the Wind River Range into the private sanctuary of the Bechtel home. It was here, among the everyday artifacts of a young marriage, that detectives discovered a series of personal journals belonging to Steve. The physical notebooks were ordinary, with thin, lined paper and covers worn at the edges, but the words inside felt like a sharp intake of breath in a quiet room. The ink was dark, sometimes pressed so hard into the page that it left an embossed ghost of the letters on the reverse side. Investigators read through undated entries that crackled with a disturbing energy, describing violent impulses and dark fantasies directed toward women. There were poems that spoke of murder and the meticulous hiding of a body, words that seemed to transform the husband from a grieving partner into a figure of deep suspicion. To the police, these were the hidden maps of a troubled mind, a window into a darkness that Amy might have lived alongside. Steve would later argue that these were merely lyrics for his band, the raw and exaggerated expressions of a creative outlet. But in the sterile light of the precinct, the distinction between art and intent began to blur into a terrifying shade of gray. As the journals were being scrutinized, the timeline of July 24th, 1997, was laid out like a puzzle with missing pieces. Steve's alibi centered on a trip to the rugged terrain of Dubois, approximately 75 miles north of Lander. He described a day spent among the ancient granite, scouting rock-climbing routes with his friend Sam Leitner. It was a world of chalk-stained fingers, the grit of stone under fingernails, and the vast, unblinking sky of the Wyoming wilderness. Sam corroborated the story, testifying to their shared hours in the backcountry Yet the investigators remained restless. They searched for gaps, for those small, unmonitored windows of time where a vehicle could have sped across the winding mountain roads. A witness had come forward, claiming to have seen a truck remarkably similar to Steve's in the area where Amy's car was found, and within that truck, a woman with blonde hair. This sighting became a focal point, a flicker of movement in the peripheral vision of the case that refused to be dismissed. The contrast was stark. The peaceful image of a man climbing toward the clouds versus the investigators' suspicion of a man driving frantically through the shadows of the pines. The tension reached a breaking point on August 1st, 1997, during a formal interrogation that felt more like a psychological siege. The room was small, the air thick with the smell of sweat and the relentless ticking of a wall clock. The detectives decided to play a dangerous hand, falsely telling Steve they had hard evidence that proved he had murdered his wife. They watched his face, looking for the minute twitch of a muscle or the glassiness of a lie. Instead of crumbling, Steve terminated the interview, a wall of silence rising between him and the law. This refusal to continue, coupled with his decision to decline a polygraph test on the advice of his attorney, Kent Spence, sent shockwaves through the community. To the police, a refusal was a neon sign of guilt, a rejection of the one tool that could supposedly clear his name. To his legal counsel, it was a necessary shield against a system that had already decided on a villain. The image of the polygraph machine, the scrolling paper, the rhythmic needles, the wires that bind a person to their own heartbeat, loomed over the investigation like a specter, representing a truth that remained just out of reach. The fallout of these events began to fracture the very foundation of the search. Amy's family, who had initially stood side by side with Steve in the tall grass and the deep woods, began to feel the cold creep of doubt. They recalled small things, moments where he seemed too controlling, or times when his tone toward Amy carried a sharp, metallic edge. The journals, once private reflections, were now being whispered about in the streets of Lander, turning the town's sympathy into a watchful, uneasy silence. Steve retreated from the public eye, his cooperation with the authorities effectively ending as the legal battle lines were drawn. The search for Amy was no longer just a battle against the elements. It had become a battle of narratives. One side saw a man unjustly accused and haunted by the loss of his wife, while the other saw a strategist who had buried his secrets in the same mountains he loved to climb. The investigation stalled in this state of permanent suspicion, leaving the questions of the journals and the gaps in the alibi to echo through the canyons, unanswered and heavy with the weight of the missing. The mountain does not yield its secrets easily. In the days following the discovery of the white Toyota Tercel at Burnt Gulch, the silence of the Shoshone National Forest was shattered by the rhythmic thrumming of helicopters and the heavy tread of 1,000 boots. The air in the Wind River Range, usually thin and sharp with the scent of lodgepole pine and ancient granite, became thick with the desperate energy of a community unwilling to accept a void. Searchers moved in long, jagged lines through the underbrush, their orange vests vivid against the deep, hunter greens of the forest floor. They moved with a slow, deliberate cadence, poking long wooden staffs into the tangled roots of mountain mahogany and stepping carefully over the treacherous, shifting scree. Every snap of a dry twig underfoot sent a jolt of adrenaline through the volunteers, a momentary hope that they had found a clue, only to be met again by the indifferent rustle of the wind. The terrain was a vertical labyrinth of hidden drainages and sudden drop-offs, a place where a single person could be swallowed by the shadows of a limestone cliff in the blink of an eye. As the sun climbed high over the peaks, the heat began to radiate off the sun-bleached rocks, creating a shimmering haze that made the distant ridges look like waves on a gray, motionless sea. The searchers called her name, over and over, until their voices grew hoarse and thin, the sound of Amy's name drifting upward only to be lost in the vast, unanswering sky. Among the most haunting figures in this expanding search were the scent dogs. Their handlers moved with a focused intensity, watching the twitch of a nose or the tension in a leash. These animals, trained to find what human eyes miss, were the thin thread of hope connecting the present to the moment Amy vanished. On the second and third days, the dogs seemed to catch a whisper of her. They led the teams away from the car, winding 3 or 4 miles down the dusty road, their tails high and their bodies leaning into the scent. The searchers held their breath, following the low, rhythmic panting of the hounds through the heat. But then, at a small, unremarkable side road, the trail simply evaporated. The dogs circled, their noses pressed hard against the dry earth, their whines becoming high-pitched and anxious as the scent they had been chasing vanished into the thin mountain air. It was as if she had stepped off the face of the earth, or as some feared, into a vehicle that had carried her far beyond the reach of a bloodhound's nose. The handlers knelt in the dirt, their hands stroking the velvet ears of their frustrated companions, while the realization settled over the group like a cold fog. The trail was not just cold, it was gone. The wilderness had reclaimed its stillness, leaving nothing but the smell of sun-baked dust and the distant, mocking cry of a Clark's nutcracker in the canopy above. As the hours bled into days, the search effort took on a technological desperation. 2 private helicopters hovered over the jagged peaks like dragonflies, their thermal sensors scanning for a heat signature that would signify life amidst the cold stones. An infrared detection device was flown in from Cheyenne, a piece of high-tech machinery meant to pierce the veil of the dense forest canopy. Even the reaches of outer space were recruited. Authorities reached out to NASA, hoping that the Russian space station Mir might have captured a stray image of the loop road on that fateful July afternoon. The contrast was jarring. The most advanced surveillance technology of the late 1990s pitted against the primordial, unyielding rock of Wyoming. Down on the ground, the physical reality was much more grueling. Volunteers spent thousands of man-hours checking abandoned mining shafts that plummeted into the darkness, their flashlight beams dancing over rusted iron and damp timber. They peered into limestone caves where the air was perpetually chilled and smelled of wet stone and old earth. They waded through the icy, clear waters of Fry Lake and Fiddler's Lake, the mountain runoff numbing their legs as they searched the shallows for anything that didn't belong. Every culvert, every hollow log, and every dense thicket was mapped and marked, yet the mountain remained a blank page. The frustration was a physical weight, a pressure behind the eyes of the investigators who looked at their topographical maps and saw only a vast, green wilderness that refused to give up its prize. On the 28th of July, the weather turned. The bright, oppressive sun was swallowed by heavy, bruised clouds that rolled over the Wind River Range with a low, guttural growl of thunder. A torrential rain began to fall, turning the dusty trails into slick, treacherous sluices of mud. The searchers were forced to retreat, their rain gear slick and dripping as they huddled under the hatches of their trucks. The rain was not a cleansing force, it was a thief. It washed away potential footprints, diluted scents, and chilled the bones of those who were already exhausted. The sound of the downpour against the granite peaks was deafening, a relentless drumming that seemed to drown out the very possibility of finding Amy alive. When the storm finally broke, the forest felt different, heavy and saturated. The sweet smell of wet sage rose from the valley floors, and the mountains were shrouded in a low-hanging mist that clung to the trees like damp wool. It was during these quiet, sodden hours that the mood of the search began to shift. The talk of a rescue, of finding a runner with a twisted ankle or a woman lost in the woods, began to fade into a somber, unspoken acknowledgement of something darker. The sheriff's office began to speak of saturation points. They ordered duplicates of Amy's running shoes and her yellow tank top, not to help find her trail, but to help searchers recognize what might be left behind. The focus was expanding, moving from the trails and the meadows to the places where secrets are buried, old cabins, deep wells, and the silent, forgotten corners of the forest. By the 31st of July, 1 week after Amy had checked the time at the photo shop and vanished, the massive search was officially scaled back. The hundreds of volunteers who had spent their days scanning the brush were replaced by a smaller, more specialized group of detectives and forensic experts. The area around the loop road was no longer just a search grid. It was now treated as a crime scene. The transition was marked by a heavy, hollow silence that settled over Lander. Yellow ribbons fluttered from porch lamps and storefronts in town, their bright color a stark contrast to the growing dread. Thousands of flyers, bearing Amy's smiling face and her blonde hair tucked behind her ears, were plastered on every available surface, the paper beginning to curl at the edges under the Wyoming sun. Investigators stood on the side of the road where her car had been found, looking out over the vast expanse of the Shoshone National Forest. They saw the same trees, the same rocks, and the same winding paths they had traversed a dozen times, but the context had shifted. The wilderness was no longer a place of recreation or beauty. It had become a sprawling, silent witness. The echoes of the search, the calling of her name, the barking of the dogs, the roar of the engines, began to die down, leaving behind only the cold, hard facts and the terrifying reality that in the heart of the mountains, a woman had simply ceased to exist. The wind in the Wind River Range does not merely blow, it breathes. It moves through the lodgepole pines with a hollow, rhythmic sigh, a sound that seems to carry the weight of everything lost within its jagged peaks. By the end of July, 1997, that wind had grown cold, carrying the first faint scent of an early autumn that Amy would never see. The massive search effort, once a thrumming engine of hope involving hundreds of boots on the ground and rotors churning the thin mountain air, had begun to stutter. The volunteers, their faces sun-scorched and eyes rimmed with the red dust of the trails, slowly descended the mountain, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt heavy. The tracks in the dirt, the broken branches, and the ribbons of plastic tape marking search grids were the only things left of the frantic energy that had once filled the Shoshone National Forest. Beneath the vast, indifferent blue of the Wyoming sky, the mountains held their secrets close, wrapped in the shadows of granite cliffs and the tangled roots of the basin floor. For years, the investigation into Amy's disappearance felt like a walk through a thick, impenetrable fog. Suspicions had flickered like dying embers, mostly directed toward those closest to her, but the lack of physical evidence turned every lead into a ghost. However, far across the high desert plains, in a landscape dominated by sagebrush and the shimmering heat of the Great Basin, a different kind of darkness was beginning to surface. It was a darkness that lived in the peripheries, in the quiet, dusty corners of the state where the roads stretch out for miles without a single house in sight. This was the realm of the itinerant, the drifters, and the men who chose to live in the gaps between society. In the early 2000s, a name began to emerge from the cold files of the Wyoming Division of Criminal Investigation, a name that tasted like iron and old oil: Dale Wayne Eaton. He was a man who moved through the world like a shadow, a welder by trade, whose hands were perpetually stained with the soot of his craft and the grime of the machines he tended. To understand the threat Eaton posed, one must envision the place he called home. Near the tiny town of Monada, Wyoming, a place that is little more than a wide spot in the road 75 miles west of Casper, Eaton lived on a patch of sun-baked earth. His residence was not a house of wood and stone, but an old, converted school bus, its yellow paint peeling away like sunburnt skin to reveal the rusted metal beneath. The bus sat in the middle of a desolate expanse, surrounded by the skeletal remains of old cars and the sharp, metallic tang of scrap iron. There was no running water, no steady power, only the low hum of the wind and the occasional hiss of a propane stove. It was here, amidst the silence of the desert, that Eaton allegedly kept his most horrific trophies. In 2002, investigators would unearth a secret buried deep in that dry, alkaline soil. Beneath the dirt, they found a black Honda CRX, its frame crushed but its identity unmistakable. It was the car belonging to Lisa Marie Kimmel, a young woman known to the public as Lil Miss, who had vanished in 1988. Eaton had not only taken her life, but had buried her vehicle on his property, keeping it like a hidden memory beneath his feet for 14 long years. The discovery of the Lil Miss car sent a shockwave through the cold case units of the West. If Eaton was capable of such meticulous, long-term concealment, what else was hidden in the vastness of the Great Basin? Profilers began to look at the timeline of his life, tracing his movements across state lines and through the mountain passes of Wyoming, Utah, and Nevada. They found a man who was frequently in the right place at the most terrible of times. Most chillingly, the timeline led them back to the summer of 1997. According to testimony from Eaton's own brother, Dale had been camping in the Wind River Mountains during the very week Amy disappeared. The location his brother described was an area called Burnt Gulch, a rugged, beautiful expanse of wilderness popular with hunters and fishermen. Burnt Gulch was not just in the general vicinity. It was a mere stone's throw from the loop road where Amy's white Toyota had been found abandoned. The thought of it is a cold finger down the spine. Amy, light-footed and breathing hard as she mapped her race course, and Eaton, a predator in a green van, perhaps watching from the cover of the pines, his presence as unseen as a mountain lion in the brush. Eaton's pattern of violence was not one of sudden, uncontrollable rage, but of calculated, opportunistic predation. Just 2 months after Amy vanished, in September of 1997, Eaton struck again in the Red Desert. He came across the Breeden family, who were stranded on the side of the road with car trouble. He offered them help, a ride in his van, but once they were inside, the mask slipped. He drew a weapon, attempting to kidnap the couple and their infant child. It was only through a desperate, violent struggle, the father wrestling for the gun while the mother fought back with a knife, that they managed to escape his clutches. This incident revealed the terrifying reality of Eaton's method. He targeted the vulnerable, the isolated, and those who had no reason to suspect the man offering a helping hand. As investigators compared this botched kidnapping to the disappearance of Amy Wroe Bechtel, the similarities were impossible to ignore. A lone woman on a remote mountain road, a man with a van and a deep knowledge of the local terrain, and a silence that followed every encounter. Though Eaton has never spoken a word about Amy, his refusal to cooperate has only deepened the shadow he casts over the basin. The possibility of a chance encounter in those high altitudes is a haunting one. Imagine the smell of the mountain air, crisp, pine-scented, and clean, suddenly cut by the sharp odor of exhaust and the heavy, metallic presence of a stranger. Amy would have been focused on her stride, the rhythm of her heart, and the beauty of the landscape she loved. She would have had no way of knowing that a man convicted of some of the most heinous crimes in the region was haunting the same trails. Today, Dale Wayne Eaton remains behind bars, his life defined by the crimes he has been convicted of, while the questions surrounding Amy remain as unanswered as the calls of the crows over the Wind River peaks. The case files grow thicker, the pages yellowing with the passage of decades, but the connection between the Great Basin killer and the runner who never came home remains a chilling, unresolved knot in the history of the West. We are left to wonder if the truth is buried as deeply as the black car in Moneta, waiting for a light that may never come to illuminate the darkest corners of the Wyoming wilderness. The wind in the Shoshone National Forest has a way of carrying voices that are no longer there. It is a thin, biting wind that whistles through the needles of the lodgepole pines and scrapes against the ancient, gray granite of the Wind River Range. For 27 years, That wind has been the only constant witness to the space where Amy Wroe Bechtel used to be. The seasons have turned 27 times, burying the trails in heavy white blankets of snow, and then unearthing them again under the pale heat of the Wyoming summer sun. In the beginning, there was a frantic energy to the silence. There were hundreds of boots treading over the dry earth, the sharp scent of search dogs, and the rhythmic thrumming of helicopters slicing through the thin mountain air. But as the weeks stretched into months, and the months into years, the frantic noise faded, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the town of Lander. The vibrant, gold and green landscape that Amy loved to run through became a graveyard without a headstone, a place where the earth simply refused to give up its secrets. You can still feel it if you stand near Burnt Gulch today. The air is crisp, carrying the faint, sweet smell of sagebrush and the damp, earthy scent of the forest floor. But there is an emptiness that no amount of natural beauty can fill. By the time 1998 arrived, the hope that had once fueled the search began to ossify into something much heavier. It was during this year that a profound shift occurred, a transition from a search for a living woman to the grim, legal acceptance of a life cut short. The 1998 Declaration of Legal Death was not just a piece of paper filed in a quiet courthouse. It was a surrender to the mountain. It was the moment the ink dried on a story that had no ending. Imagine the atmosphere of that room, the smell of old, bound ledgers and the sterile, fluorescent light reflecting off polished wooden tables. The legal proceedings were cold and clinical, a sharp contrast to the warm, athletic energy Amy had radiated just a year before. This declaration changed the texture of the mystery. It allowed the world to stop looking for a survivor and start looking for a body. In the aftermath of that 1998 ruling, the media coverage began to change its tone. The articles in magazines like People and Outside moved from the present tense to the past. They spoke of her Olympic dreams as a ghost might speak of the sun. The white Toyota Tercel, which had sat so enigmatically at the edge of the road, was no longer a sign of a temporary disappearance, but a monument to a permanent absence. The community of Lander felt this shift in their bones. The posters on the shop windows began to fade, the vibrant blue of Amy's eyes in the photographs slowly turning to a pale, sun-bleached gray, until they were eventually taken down, leaving behind only the ghost of a tape mark on the glass. As the years stretched toward the new millennium, the shadows around the case only deepened. The suspicion that had settled over her husband, Steve, like a heavy fog, never truly lifted, even as he moved on with his life, remarried, and stayed within the very community that whispered his name. There were those journals, filled with dark, rhythmic lyrics that the police found so chilling, words of violence and control that seemed to clash so violently with the image of the young, happy couple buying their first home. The tension between his alibi of rock climbing and the strange, unconfirmed sightings of a truck like his on the loop road remained an open wound. But there were other shadows, two darker ones that emerged from the periphery of the Wyoming wilderness. The name Dale Wayne Eaton began to circulate through the halls of the sheriff's office. Eaton, a man whose history was a tapestry of unspeakable acts, was known to be in the area during that fateful summer of 1997. He was a predator who understood the silence of the mountains better than most. Investigators looked at the Lil Miss case, the tragic end of Lisa Marie Kimmel, and they saw a pattern of cruelty that could have easily swallowed Amy in a chance encounter. Yet, even with these names and these theories, the evidence remained as elusive as the mountain mist. No DNA, no clothing, not even a single strand of hair was ever recovered from the vast expanse of the Shoshone. The mystery became a cold, hard thing, like the stones at the bottom of a glacial lake, unreachable and unmoving. Now we stand 27 years removed from that bright July afternoon when Amy tied her laces and set out to map a course for a race she would never run. The case is officially cold, a file tucked away in a drawer, waiting for a piece of technology or a sudden confession to breathe life back into it. But for the people who knew her, and for the strangers who have been haunted by her story, the case is never truly cold. It lives in the way the light hits the peaks of the Wind River Range at dusk, turning the snow to a bruised purple. It lives in the cautious glances of runners who head out onto the trails alone, feeling the prickle of eyes in the tree line. The weight of these 27 years is a heavy burden for her family, who have lived through more than 9,000 days of not knowing. They have lived through the birthdays she never had, the Olympics she never attended, and the quiet moments of a life that was supposed to be long and full. There is a specific kind of grief in a disappearance, a suspended animation of the soul. There is no grave to visit, no place to lay a flower, only the vastness of the Wyoming wilderness. The mountain remains silent, its towering peaks indifferent to the questions we ask. It keeps its secrets in the deep ravines and the thickets of willow, under the layers of pine needles that have accumulated since 1997. Amy is a part of the mountain now, a whisper in the wind, a shadow that moves through the trees just as the sun begins to set. As we reach the end of our journey into the shadows of the Wind River Range, we are left with the image of a young woman in her prime, full of strength and hope, running toward a horizon she would never reach. The silence of the mountain is not an empty thing. It is full of the echoes of what might have been. We may never know if it was a man in the shadows, a tragic accident, or the mountain itself that claimed her. But in the stillness of the night, we can remember her spirit, the determination of a runner, the joy of a new home, and the beauty of a life that, however brief, left an indelible mark on the high country of Wyoming. The air in your room is warm and safe. The shadows here are only shadows, soft and familiar. The mountain is far away, and its secrets are tucked away beneath the stars. You can let the questions go now. You can let the mystery settle into the back of your mind, like the last embers of a campfire fading into the dark. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.